What's up, Squad? It's your Squid, aka the Anxious Squid, here at Anxious Squid Productions. These guys are the people that support my channel financially. I like money. Turning some of yours into mine on a monthly basis would be ideal. No one here suggested this. However, I really like history, right? The logic behind this is I really like history. I'm going to put these reaction videos in my history playlist with the history videos that I create as well. And hopefully that'll foster some more views in there and we'll see how that goes. But as an American immigrant, I don't know a lot about American history. I do really like Hank and John Green though. They're really cool. I watch Vlogbrothers. I watch a whole bunch of their content on YouTube. They have a million different channels. One of their channels is Crash Course. Crash Course helps me learn about lots and lots of different things, and they have a playlist of Crash Course US history. You probably already know that. I'm probably explaining things for no reason right at the start here, but yeah, I decided we're gonna watch some Crash Course, and I'm gonna react to it as an American immigrant, and we'll see how that goes for views, and see if you guys like that, and you know, go from there. But I'm gonna start off with the preview for the series, and then we're gonna dive straight into episode 1. So I'll see you after the jingle. But yeah, if this is the sort of thing you're into, let me know in the comments section. Let me know with your likes and dislikes, and if this is the first time you've stumbled across my channel, sorry for talking your ear off before we actually get to the content, but yeah, let's actually get to the content. As always, guys, thanks for your patience in between uploads, and yeah, if this is the first time you've stumbled across my channel, don't judge me just based off this video. Poke around. I've got a whole bunch of different playlists there, very obviously titled. You'll know what you're looking at. I'm sure you'll find something you like. Then yeah, do me a solid and hit the subscribe. But
hi, and welcome to Crash Course.
Let's watch this video first, shall we?
U.S. History. Hi, and welcome to Crash Course U.S. History, a course that approximately follows the AP U.S. History curriculum as it appeared in 2013. And even though we call it U.S. History, we do begin before any Europeans show up in North America. From the 15th century,
continental America, yeah.
The country's history until we reach Barack Obama's presidency. This will include all the well-known events. We'll learn about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, women's suffrage, the World Wars, civil rights, and so on. But we'll introduce you to some lesser-known events and people as well.
I'm fucking excited.
Primary sources that do a deep dive into how people were reacting to the time period they were living through. We'll also consider who was given the privilege to have their reactions recorded. Because when citizens are marginalized based on class, gender, or race, that history isn't just history. It touches every part of the present. So we'll learn it all together and try to make sense of the United States' complicated history. Oh, and if John gets the mystery document wrong, he'll be shocked. Literally.
Land of the Awesome since 1776. Alrighty, so that's
hi, I'm John.
That's the intro. That's the preview, right? And if it sounds like something you want to look at and you want to watch, independent of an Australian/American immigrant, a new American learning about the country he has moved to be with his wife and kids and stuff. If you want to watch it without me learning and asking questions along the way, then by all means go and hit subscribe to Crash Course. And yeah, hopefully though, you'll enjoy watching me react to learning about all of this, and obviously I'm going to give my opinions along the way. If you've seen some of my other history videos, I try and make educational and informative history videos about Australia as well, so I'm going to probably relate the two a lot, like what I know about Australian history compared to American history and stuff, but yeah, let's just dive into it, like balls and all. First episode, The Black Legend, Native Americans and Spaniards. Crash Course US History number 1. Alright, I can hear my daughter needs my help outside with school stuff, so I'm going to click and then we'll get into it. Alright, that's what I get for trying to record while she's doing remote learning at school, right? Anyway, The Black Legend, Native Americans and Spaniards. Crash Course US History numero 1. Let's get into it.
Crash Course U.S. History. Now,
fucking hell, John Green looks young there, doesn't he?
About the 16th century today, when this was neither united nor states. By the way, this globe reflects the fact that I believe that Alaskan statehood is illegitimate. In fact, we're going to call this whole show U.S. History, but inevitably it's going to involve other parts of the world, and also, not to brag, a small part of the moon. All right, we can be a little bit self-aggrandizing sometimes here in America.
Tip a canoe and freedom fries
We're not
100.
going to talk about the United States or this guy. We're going to talk about the people who lived here before any Europeans showed up.
Alright. I know in my area of the state specifically, it was the Iroquois, or the Iroquois, I don't
was home
know.
to a great variety of people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. One, when the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, Native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals.
Wait,
However,
what?
they did have farm...
I'm confused here.
North America was home to a great variety of...
I thought the Aztecs and the Incas... Maybe I'm getting my geography wrong. Like, they must be in South America. I thought they were in, like, fucking, there we go, right? What do I know? Started and not finished. 3 separate history degrees at 3 separate universities on 3 separate continents. And I'm getting fucking continents confused.
people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. One, when the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, Native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals.
What's
However,
that little
they
say
did
thing?
have
They might have
farming
domesticated the dog?
empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, Native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no
Native Americans probably did have one brand of domesticated animal, the dog, but as everyone knows, dogs are most often a parasitic hindrance. Dogs were likely a net disadvantage for Indians. Okay.
domesticated animals. However, they did have farming, complex social and political structures, and widespread trade networks. Mr. Green! So they were pretty backwards, huh? Well, I mean, or at least primitive. Primitive is a funny word me from the past.
Weird,
because
yeah.
it implies a romanticization, these simple people who never used...
Like, social Darwinism's not a thing. There's not just some linear way that people fucking progress and that, like, we're always going to end up at this point, you know? Like, it's... The thing I learnt a lot about at university was a thing called situated knowledge, which is, you know, you can only know what your area around you can teach you, and it's hard to build things like classical fucking buildings with the Roman pillars and all that sort of stuff, and if you don't have domesticated stock-bearing animals, you know, like a yak or a fucking ox or a fucking horse that you know can drag a cart or a donkey or whatever, you know, like if you don't have these animals that can drag big weights for you, then you're very limited in your building capacity. If you don't have, you know what I'm saying, like situated knowledge, and you need certain things to be in place to get certain other things with butterfly effects. It's not just this, alright, we start out as primitive, then we go to farming, and then we go to, we start out as hunter-gatherer, then we go to farming, and then we go to this, and then this, and then this, and then eventually we have the internet. Like, there's no how to do it. There's no recipe for civilization like that, you know? And so people, when they say primitive, they mean not as far advanced as us, but they could be far more advanced than us in our other aspects, if that makes sense. You know, like, for example, and I will get to the video straight away, I promise I will get back to this. This is sort of how I roll. I talk and pause and do this sort of thing. But, like, a perfect example is the Pacific Ocean, right? So in the late 1700s, James Cook was floating haphazardly around the Pacific Ocean looking for the Great Southern Land, later to be known as Australia. And he was just floating around looking for it because he didn't know where it was. They didn't know how to fucking, like, go certain places and do certain things. They were lost in the Pacific Ocean, right? It's not too much of a stretch to say that. For various parts of their journey, they were lost. In the same very bit of ocean, you had Polynesians and Melanesians who were able to literally stick their hand in the water, and from the temperature and the direction the water was going, in combination with the stars that they were looking at, tell you to take a ride at the next roundabout. You know what I mean? Like, the situated knowledges of the two sets of people. You had the British and you had the fucking, like, they were you know what I'm saying? The comparisons, those two sets of people and those two civilizations are extremely different, but they knew far more about how to, like, the Melanesians and the Polynesians and Pacific Islanders in general knew far more about how to traverse that part of the ocean because they were in it than the Brits did. You know what I mean? Like, it's about situated knowledge, and people who say primitive, I think, are stuck in that education or the belief system that civilization is linear like that, and it's just not, you know?
more than they needed and had no use for guns, and it also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe that just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans.
So that's the short version of what I just said, yeah.
Well, I mean, or at least primitive. Primitive is a funny word to me from the past because it implies a romanticization, these simple people who never used more than they needed and had no use for guns, and it also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe that just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans. But you can't see the human story as one that goes from primitive to civilized. That's not just Eurocentric, that's contemporary-centric. Yeah. The idea that we're moving forward as a species implies a linear progression that just does not reflect the reality of life on this planet. I get that you like to imagine...
Just gotta say, I fucking love it when people like John Green or Hank Green, and I agree, makes me feel really smart.
Yourself as the result of millennia of advancement to the very pinnacle of humanness, but from where I'm sitting, that worldview is a lot more backwards than living without the wheel. So no one knows exactly how many people lived in North America before the Europeans got here. Some estimates are as high as 75 million, but in the present U.S. borders, the guesses are between 2 and 10 million. And like other Native Americans, their populations were decimated by diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Yep. Actually, it was much worse than decimation. As many of you have pointed out, decimation means 1 in 10. This was much worse than that. It was closer maybe to 8 in 10.
I didn't know that was the definition of decimation.
So there had been civilizations in North America, but they peaked before the Europeans arrived. The Zuni and Hopi civilization, round about here, peaked about 1200 CE. They had large family dwellings in canyons, which they probably left because of drought. Crash Course World History fans will remember that environmental degradation often causes the decline of civilizations. I'm looking at you,
situated knowledge,
and also you, entire future Earth. But complex civilizations weren't the rule in North America, and now we're about to begin generalizing. A bad habit historians have, partly because there's a limited historical record, but also because Eurocentric historians have a bad habit of primitivizing and simplifying.
The noble savage,
so I want to underscore that there was huge diversity in the pre-Columbus American experience, and they're talking about someone who lived
That's a really interesting map. I haven't seen that map before.
Primitivizing and simplifying others. So I want to underscore that
that's fucking cool. I need a copy of that map somewhere. Like, that's really intriguing. So I'm from up, like, I don't know if you guys know, like, I live in Niagara Falls, New York. That's really interesting. So that'd be the 6 nations up there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, there's 8 in that different section of color. But anyway, that's super intriguing.
American experience, and they're talking about someone who lived here in 1000 BCE, and talking about someone who lived here 2,000 years later is just inherently problematic.
Yeah, not the same thing.
That said, let's go to the thought bubble. Most native groups in most places organized as tribes, and their lives were dominated by the natural resources available where they lived. So West Coast Indians primarily lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting sea mammals. Great Plains Indians were often buffalo hunters. These tribal bands often united into loose confederacies or leagues, the best known of which was probably the Iroquois Confederacy, also called the Great League of Peace. This was kind of like an upstate New York version of NATO, but without nuclear weapons or the incessant international meddling or Latvians. Okay, it was nothing like NATO, actually. Religion usually involved a vibrant spiritual world with ceremonies geared toward the tribe's life.
Ayahuasca and fucking
focused on animals, agricultural
DMT and all that.
And most Indian groups believed in a single creator god who stood above all the other deities, but they weren't monotheistic in the way that Christians who came to the New World were. American Indians also saw property very differently from Europeans.
That's interesting.
To First Peoples, land was a common resource that village leaders could assign families to use, but not to own, and most land was seen as common to everyone.
Makes sense.
Blackhawk, a leader of the Sauk tribe, said, "The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence, and so long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have a right to the soil." Thanks, Thought Bubble. So many of us tend to romanticize American Indians as being immune from greed and class, but in fact there were class distinctions.
The noble savage,
Rulers tended to come from the same families, for instance. That said, wealth was much more evenly distributed than it was in Europe. And while most tribal leaders were men, many tribes were matrilineal, meaning that children became members of their mother's family. Also, women were often important religious leaders. Women also often owned dwellings and tools, although not land, because again, that idea did not exist. Also, in many tribes, women engaging in premarital scoodly pooping wasn't taboo. In general, they were just much less obsessed with female chastity than Europeans were. I mean, I will remind you, the first English settlement in America was called Virginia. The idea that Native Americans were noble savages, somehow purer than Europeans and untouched by their vices is not a new one. Like some of the earliest Europeans saw the Indians as paragons of physical beauty and innocent of Europeans' worst characteristics. But for most Europeans, there was little noble about what they saw as pure Indian savagery. I mean, Indians didn't have writing, they suffered from the terrible character flaw of being able to have sex without feeling ashamed, and most importantly, they weren't Christians. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore this part of the world. Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in what is now Florida in 1513 looking for gold in the fabled Fountain of Youth. In 1521, he encountered a Calusa Brave's poison-tipped arrow and died before discovering that the Fountain of Youth is, of course, delicious Diet Dr. Pepper. Oh, I can taste all 23 flavors. There were many more Spanish explorers in the first half of the 16th century, including one Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who wandered through the American Southwest looking for gold, which I mention entirely because I think that guy's last name means cowhead. Of course, people found any gold, but they did make later European colonization easier by bringing over the microbes that wiped out most native populations. So the Spanish wanted to colonize Florida and set up military bases to thwart the pirates who preyed on silver-laden Spanish galleons coming out of Mexico. But Spanish missionaries also came over hoping to convert local native populations. This, of course, worked out magnificently, just kidding, it went terribly, and many of the missions were destroyed by an uprising of Gual Indians in 1597, and I will remind you, mispronouncing things is my thing. In general, colonizing Florida sucked because it was hot and mosquito-y. Spain was much more successful at colonizing the American Southwest. In 1610, Spain established its first permanent settlement in the Southwest of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and you couldn't really say that it flourished since Santa Fe's population never got much above 3,000, but it had a great small-town feel. And New Mexico is really important because it's the site of the first large-scale uprising by Native Americans against Europeans. I mean, the native people, who the Spanish called pueblos, had seen their fortunes decline significantly since the arrival of Europeans. How much decline? Well, between 1600 and 1680, their population went from about 60,000 to about 17,000.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Yikes. To convert the indigenous people became increasingly militant about stamping out all native religion. The Spanish Inquisition just wasn't very keen on the kind of cultural blending that made early conversion efforts successful. So while the Spanish saw all the pueblos as one people, they also knew there were tribal differences that made it difficult for the Indians to unite and rise up against the Spanish. But nothing unites like a common enemy, and in 1680, a religious leader named Pope organized an uprising to drive the Spaniards out. Pope organized about 2,000 warriors who killed 400 Spanish colonists and forced the rest to leave Santa Fe.
Fucking hell, that's a movement.
New Mexico was effectively destroyed. The pueblos tore down all the Christian churches and replaced them with kivas, their places of worship. But like most awesome uprisings, it didn't last. But after the revolt, the Spanish were much more tolerant of indigenous religion, and they also abandoned the forced labor practice called encomienda. Oh, it's time for the new crash course feature, the mystery.
That's interesting.
How mysterious.
Encomienda. I pronounced that wrong as well.
Are simple. I read and attempt to identify the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked by this shock pen, and if I am wrong, I do. Okay, what do we have here? The Indians were totally deprived of their freedom and were put in the harshest, fiercest, most horrible servitude and captivity, which no one who has not seen it can understand. Even beasts enjoy more freedom when they are allowed to graze in the fields.
Fucking hell, that's a line.
Gave no such
Even beasts are allowed more freedom when they're allowed to graze in the fields.
Perpetual slaves. I sometimes came upon dead bodies on my way, and upon others who were grasping and moaning in their death agony, repeating, "Hungry, hungry." And this was the freedom, the good treatment, and the Christianity the Indians received.
It's pretty fucking disgusting.
Nice. Okay, so the mystery document is always a primary source, and since the writer refers to our Spaniards, I'm gonna guess that he or she, probably he, is European, and a Spaniard sympathetic to the Indians, which narrows the list of suspects considerably. So it probably wasn't De Sepulveda, for instance, who argued that the Indians might not even be human. Okay, so I'm actually pretty confident here. I believe it is from a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas. God dang it! Stan just told me I have the author right, but the book wrong. It's a history of the Indies. Oh, I hate shocks, both literal and metaphorical. So we focused a lot on the brutality of the Spanish toward the Indians, but at least one Spaniard, De las Casas, recognized that his countrymen were terrible. This realization is a good thing, obviously, but it leads us to one of the big problems when it comes to studying this time and place. The Black Legend is the tale that the Spanish unleashed unspeakable cruelty on the Indians. Now that tale is true, but that idea was used by later settlers, especially the English, to justify their own settlements. Like, part of the reason they needed to expand their empire was to...
Like propaganda agenda sort of thing, like, oh, we're not as bad as those cunts, you know, like it's often one of the things that gets spoken about in Australia, you know, oh, well, if the British didn't arrive and subjugate and commit genocide upon the Aboriginals, then, like, what would you have preferred? Did you see what the Belgians did in the Congo? Would you have preferred that? Like, as if coming and committing horrible things, even though other people have done worse things around the world, like, it's okay because you're not as bad as them. And it's just such a fucking shit argument. Such a like, it's not a genuine discussion point, you know? At the point that you're having an academic discussion about, like, things like this, about history and stuff, and people are like, oh, well, you know, at least it wasn't X, Y, Z. Like, yeah, obviously, at least they weren't doing X, Y, Z, but they were doing W, X, Y, you know? So that's what we're talking about here, you know? Don't fucking... The whataboutism when people talk about history is often very frustrating, you know?
Save the Indians from the awful Spanish, but were the English so much better? Yeah, probably not. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, American Indians didn't have writing, so we don't have records of their perspective.
Yeah.
Now, some Europeans, like De las Casas, were critical of the Spaniards, but most considered the Indians heathens and implied, or even outright said, that they deserved whatever horrible things
same in Australia.
At the beginning of our series, I want to point out something that we need to remember throughout. One of the great things about American history is that we have a lot of written sources. This is the advantage of the U.S. coming onto the scene so late in the game.
Same for Australia.
Speaking. But every story we hear comes from a certain point of view, and we always need to remember who is speaking, why they are speaking, and especially which voices go unheard and why. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed.
That is a great first episode. I really enjoyed that. And to touch on what he was saying, when I was in high school, right, I've always been a massive history nerd. Check out this history playlist and you'll see the different things, like, you'll see proof of that. These are the people that support the channel, by the way, thanks to them and all that jazz. But yeah, the thing about, like, I'm going to rewind 10 seconds to remember what the fuck I was just talking about. Yeah, there we go. So, I studied history in high school just like everyone else, but I studied modern history, modern history, ancient history, and advanced history. And advanced history was a subject that you had to sort of be, like, I'm not trying to blow smoke up my own ass, but you had to be doing well as a student and you had to apply to be in the course, and they only select, like, there were 4 kids in the class, you know, and it was outside school hours and the head teacher of history taught it, and it was like it counted toward university stuff. And, like, the whole purpose of that advanced history was about analysing how history is written, why history is written, what the purpose of history is. History is written by the winners. The people who win the war write the story, and they will tell you the justification for why they were feeling the way they were, whether it be true or not. And Miss Martin was my history teacher in grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. And, you know, some might say the positive relationship I had with her was one of the reasons why I got into that class, as opposed to my academic rigour, which was non-existent. But the whole point of what I'm saying is, like, you got to ask the questions, you know, like, who's telling me this story? What do they stand to benefit from telling me this story and me believing that story? Who is the bad guy in this story based off what they're telling me? And, like, who stands to gain from me thinking that person's the bad guy? What is the story from both perspectives, basically? Can you look at the whole board? Instead of watching something and going, oh yeah, the bishop moved from E3 to fucking JZ, I don't know what the actual things are on a chessboard, but instead of analysing a historical scene and going, oh yep, the bishop moved from this spot to this spot, you look at the whole board and you go, alright, well, the bishop needed to move there because the rook needed to move over there, which then led to the fucking knight doing X, Y, or Z, you know? And maybe I'm not making sense, but I really enjoyed that and I learnt a couple of things there. I'm definitely going to be reacting to more Crash Course stuff in this history playlist, so if you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments. If this is the first time you've stumbled across me, poke around my channel. I've got a whole bunch of educational content in the history playlist about Australian history, and yeah, I reckon it could be fun. Me learning about American history, you learning about Australian history, just us learning about history together in this playlist. But yeah, if you have any particular part of history that you want me to react to or anything, join those guys and get your name on that list, pay me, and I'll react to it straight away. But yeah, failing all of that, I'm going to get on with my day. I will see you guys when I look at you. You'll see me when you look at me. Thanks for watching.